It was, without a doubt, the largest and deadliest war in human history. We're talking about tens of millions of people fighting all across the globe. So in the next few minutes, we're going to unpack the key moments of World War II, a conflict that completely reshaped the world we live in today. And to really get a sense of the scale here, you have to start with the human cost. An estimated 60 million lives lost. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around a number that big. But it's not just a statistic, you know? It's the backdrop for everything else we're about to cover, and it's why understanding this war is still so important. All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll look at what caused it, how it exploded into a global fight, the moment the tide began to turn, and then finally, the end of the war and the world it left behind. So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, ironically, it starts at the end of another war, World War I, the war to end all wars. It actually created the perfect storm for an even bigger, more destructive conflict.
You see, after World War I, Germany was forced to take all the blame. The winning countries slapped them with huge debts, took their land, and basically dismantled their empire. This wasn't just about money, though. For the German people, it was a deep national humiliation that would just sit there and fester for years.
And that humiliation created this terrible domino effect. The debt led to insane hyperinflation. I mean, the German currency became so worthless, people were literally using stacks of cash as wallpaper. Then, just when things started to get a little better, the 1929 Wall Street crash hits, and the whole world is thrown into an economic crisis. In Germany, this chaos and desperation created the perfect breeding ground for extremism. And that's when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were able to grab power.
With these new extremist governments in power, not just in Germany, but in other places too, the world started to get really, really dangerous. And that brings us to our next phase, a time of rapidly rising aggression. You started to see this pattern of expansion happening all at once. Germany started rebuilding its military with this goal of uniting all German-speaking people. In Italy, you had Mussolini's fascist government invading Ethiopia. And over in Asia, Imperial Japan was pushing further into China with absolute brutality. And Germany's new military came with a terrifying new tactic, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The whole idea was to hit the enemy with so much speed and so much force all at once that they would just collapse before they even knew what hit them. And man, was it effective. So now, Germany felt strong enough to make its move. First, they annexed Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia. Then, they did something nobody saw coming. They signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. It was a clever move to make sure they wouldn't have to fight a war on two fronts. And with that deal in place, Germany invaded Poland. That was the final straw. France and the UK declared war, and World War II was officially on. And the power of the Blitzkrieg was just shocking. In an incredibly short period, German forces just steamrolled across Western Europe. The French army, one of the most powerful in the world, was defeated, and Germany was now in control of most of Western Europe. And this is the moment where the conflict just explodes. It goes from being a European war to a true world war, pulling in countries from every single continent. Okay, so the two sides were pretty clear. You had the Axis powers, led by Germany, Italy, and Japan, and then you had the Allied powers, which started with the UK and France, but would soon grow to include two absolute giants, the Soviet Union, but only after they were invaded, and the United States, after they were attacked. So remember that pact between Germany and the Soviet Union? Well, Hitler decided to break it. He launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR. It was the single largest military operation in all of human history, and it opened up this massive, brutal Eastern Front that would just consume millions and millions of lives. At the same time, halfway across the world, Japan was expanding its empire in the Pacific. The US tried to stop them by cutting off their oil supply. Japan's answer was as swift as it was devastating, a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. And just like that, the sleeping giant, the United States, was in the war. So, the whole world is at war. The Axis has been dominating, but now we get to the point where things start to shift. Slowly but surely, the tide begins to turn, thanks to fierce resistance and a huge Allied comeback. But this phase of the war was also defined by unimaginable horror. Across Europe, brave civilians formed resistance movements to fight back. At the same time, the Nazi regime was building a network of extermination camps designed for the industrialized murder of millions of people. And in Asia,
Japan was forcing millions into brutal labor camps. The war wasn't just on battlefields. It was a war against civilians too.
So the Allied counterattack gets underway, and it's this huge coordinated push. They land in North Africa, then Sicily, which basically knocks Italy out of the war. From the east, the massive Soviet army starts pushing relentlessly back towards Germany. And then comes the big one, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces landed Normandy, opening up that crucial Western Front, which eventually leads to the liberation of Paris. With the Axis powers now squeezed between two massive armies in Europe and facing the unbelievable industrial power of the US in the Pacific, the end of the war was finally in sight. And the collapse happened fast. As Soviet soldiers fought their way into Berlin, Hitler committed suicide. Just days later, Germany surrendered completely. But the war in the Pacific was still raging. To force an end, the US made the terrifying decision to use a brand new weapon, the atomic bomb. After 2 bombs were dropped on Japan, the emperor surrendered. The 6-year war was finally over.
But that victory came at a price that's hard to even comprehend. The world that clawed its way out of the wreckage was changed forever.
And here's the most staggering fact of all. Of those 60 million people who died, most of them weren't soldiers. They were civilians. This was a war that completely erased the line between the battlefield and home. The old powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, they were left shattered, just exhausted. And rising from the ashes were 2 new global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. That new power dynamic would define world politics for the next 50 years. Out of all this devastation, the world came together to create something new, the United Nations. Its entire purpose was to try and make sure a catastrophe like this could never, ever happen again. So the war was over, but a tense new chapter was just beginning. The UN offered some hope, for sure. But with 2 competing superpowers now dominating the entire planet, the big question hanging over everything was, had the world really learned its lesson?